Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Bible Lands and Customs. It's me again. I hope you all are having a fantastic evening. This week has been kind of busy for us, and I am so happy that Monday is right around the corner for me. I know you guys are already experiencing Monday, but I am ready for a brand new week full of all the things that God has in store for us and ready to go ahead and close the book on last week. Thank you all so much. Those of you that have been doing your homework. Last week, we did not have a homework assignment, so the homework assignment was from the week before, and it was the simple question to define what bread and salt meant. And you should be able to find that very easily in your notes without any trouble. And if you'll make sure that you submit those, they will be recorded and go towards your final grade. And just to let you all know, there will be no homework for this lesson. However, buckle up and brace yourselves because we will have homework for sure next week and possibly the week after. So you're getting 2 weeks of a break. So no excuses for not doing that one homework assignment. All right, so today we are in chapter 9, and today we're going to discuss dress and ornamentation. We're going to talk about the clothing, what they wore, why they wore it, and the significance behind it. So first of all, as with most things, when a tradition or a custom is established, it is pretty much set in stone for the duration of a generation and generations beyond. And the same is true with the customs of dress. And it is considered morally wrong to change anything that is ancient. So everything that we're going to be discussing are things that have been established for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, right? So this goes way, way, way back, and that's the reason why even today, a lot of these customs about culture, the way they dress, you'll be familiar with them, you will have seen them in various ways, and so this will all be fairly familiar to you, but you may get a little bit of a backstory as to why you've seen this dress. Okay, so first things first, they had an inner garment. Now this was for the men and the women. They both had an inner garment, and it was like a tunic or a shirt, basically like an undershirt, an underlayering piece. And it was made of typically like, leather, hair cloth, which would be like the hide of an animal, a cow perhaps, maybe a horse. I know here in the U.S. you can buy what we call pony hair shoes or cow hide shoes, and they'll have the hair on them. Wool, linen, and the more modern material is cotton. Now, the simplest form of this tunic was without sleeves. They were sleeveless, and they generally went down to the knees or the ankles. Now, if you were wealthy, you would wear this same type of garment, but your garment would have sleeves in it. So it wouldn't be a sleeveless one. It would have probably 3/4 length or longer sleeves. Now, the lower class, or those that were less fortunate, the tunic was often the only garment that was ever worn in warmer climates. So during the summertime, they just wore this one particular garment. Now, but if you were more affluent, you may even wear, or if you were more rich, you might only wear the tunic while you were alone at home. So generally speaking, if you were out and about, if you were a more wealthy family, you would not just wear the inner garment, the tunic shirt. And you certainly wouldn't receive guests like this. Would be considered you weren't properly dressed. Now, interestingly enough, there is a Bible term for the word naked. And if you'll look in Isaiah 20, 2-4, Micah 1:8 and John 2:7 refers to someone as naked as only wearing their inner garment or their tunic. So it wasn't that they were physically naked, like actually naked, no clothes whatsoever. It was just that they were underdressed in the sense that that inner garment was the only thing that they had on. Now, most everyone had at least one change of clothes. And because of this, you know, John the Baptist says to them, if you look there on page 38 there in the middle, John the Baptist says to them, the man who has 2 shirts must share with him that has none. That's in Luke 3:11. And when Jesus sent out the 12 on a preaching and healing mission, he told them not to take an extra undergarment with them. So as a general rule, everybody had at least one change of apparel, and it would be considered, you would be considered very poor if you only had one thing. So as an act of humility, Jesus suggested the disciples just take one garment. We don't want to appear better than anyone. We want to be able to appeal to everyone that we're speaking to. So let's just, you know, humble ourselves so that we don't appear as though we have more than anyone that we go and try to minister to. And then John the Baptist was saying, if you have 2 shirts, you should be willing and kind enough to be able to share at least one of those. All right, so moving along, Jacob gave Joseph, if you'll remember this story, very familiar Sunday school story, he gave him a coat of many colors. Now, this term coat refers to a sleeved tunic. So it would have been one of the, from like the richer class or the more wealthy class, the tunic that had the actual sleeves put in it. And so it was similar to those wealthier undergarments, and it was more distinct because of the sleeves in it and the colors. So this was the everyday garment that everybody wore. It wasn't necessarily an outer garment or a robe that he would put on over top of those things. So when his brothers conspired to kill him and threw him in the pit and ripped that garment, this was the garment that they had ripped up. It would have been, I mean, he would have literally been left there naked in that pit because it was that inner garment, that tunic that he would have worn first against the body. If you'll remember when during Jesus's crucifixion, the Roman soldiers cast lots for his garment. And while it may seem like they were casting lots for his outer garment, it was actually the inner garment. And it was a tunic that did not have a seam. It was without a seam. There was no line in it where it had been sewn or put together, which definitely gave the impression that this was a more wealthy item of clothing because it did not have that seam in it. So those that were wealthier had clothes that were made of one piece of fabric. And chances are he probably was giving this by someone, one of the ladies in a town or in a province or whatever that he would venture to speak, gave it to them out of their you know, their love for him and their desire to want to be a blessing to him. So that's the inner garment. That's the first layer that that they would put on during this time. Now, the second layer was the outer tunic or a robe. Okay, this was looser and longer. It was still a kind of tunic that was used, but not by ordinary people. So it wasn't necessarily as common. I mean, everybody had an inner garment, but not everybody had an outer garment. Now, the outer garment was primarily used for the kings, prophets, nobles, and sometimes youths or the children, the young children, to be warm. All right. This was actually probably more like a third garment. So it was the inner garment, the outer tunic, and then next we'll talk about an outer garment. So, but I'm skipping ahead. All right, so going back, top of the page 39 there, we're going to talk about the girdle. Now, for you ladies out there, we're not talking about the girdles that you and I are familiar with and have heard of. This does not keep all of those squishy places put in the right spot. No, this was actually a way to belt or to bind up the inner tunic or the garments that a person was wearing. Again, this particular item of clothing was used by both men and women at various occasions. Now, if a tunic or the inner garment was ungirded, it would be very difficult for someone to walk freely. It was a long, flowing piece of fabric. It could get, wrapped around your legs or ankle. You would not have freedom of movement necessarily wearing this. It would be fine for lounging around the house or just hanging out at home or whatever, or if you weren't doing any wild activity. But if you did require more active movement, you would need a girdle, and it was always worn anytime you left the home. So when you went out, everybody had a girdle on. Now, there were two common types of girdles. The most common, was a leather girdle, and it had clasp. It was about 6 inches wide, and it was the most common, worn by Elijah, found in 2 Kings 1 and 8, and then John the Baptist in Matthew 3 and 4. The second type of girdle was more valuable. It was made out of linen or silk. Typically, it was embroidered or had some kind of needlework done on it. It was a hand breadth wide, so I'm going to say probably about 4 inches. And this type of girdle served as a pouch to keep money or other necessities. Kind of like a purse, I guess, if you will. I don't know what they call them there in the Philippines, but back in the 80s and 90s, we had a thing called a fanny pack, and you could kind of stuff all your stuff in there. They're kind of coming back in style, it's like a little crossbody bag type thing that you wear around your waist. In my mind, that's kind of what I was picturing. But anyway, this type of thing was also used to fasten the sword to the body. So the men, if they were going out somewhere, they always had their girdle on, probably kept money in it, and probably kept their sword, especially depending on what their activities were for that day. Now, there is a symbolic meaning regarding the girdle, which is, it's kind of cool to me because I hadn't really thought too much about this before, but while I was studying this, it kind of I don't know, it just gave me pause, something to kind of think about more. Jesus tells us to gird up your loins. He tells the disciples, hey, gird up your loins in Luke 12 and 35. Now, is he telling them to actually, you go right now, gird up put your girdle on, get your clothes ready. We're taking off on a journey. No, but he was symbolically telling them that, hey, what we are about to embark on, our next mission, our next venture, is going to be intense. Okay, we need to be ready to move, and we need to make sure that there's nothing that could prevent us from doing what we need to do. Now remember, those garments were very loose, and if you just left them ungirded, it's potential for you to trip, to fall, to maybe, hurt yourself, or, if you fell into, you could potentially die if you think about some of the hazards walking in the wilderness and stuff, So it was very important that they had prepared themselves, not just physically, like the physical application, applying that girdle, making sure all of their clothes were taken care of, but it was also an opportunity for them to mentally prepare themselves. We have to get ready here so that when we are physically in these situations, in this time of ministry, which, as you and I both know, ministry is not always sunshine and rainbows, but we need to mentally prepare ourselves to be ready, to gird up our loins, to make sure that we are not going to allow anything that's coming up or coming against us to keep us from doing and keep us from going forward. So very, very cool idea and thought. If you need something to teach or preach on, that's free. Make sure you look at those notes extra careful. I am kind of abbreviating some of this, so I hope it's easier to digest this way. So in Bible language, the term to be girded was to be ready for action. We must be ready at any time to do what God has called us to do. We need to make sure that we are girded about. Now I have at the end of this video, as you will recall from last week, I was unable to add in the pictures that I had talked about in the video. I'm not that clever yet. Hopefully I can figure it out at some point. But at the end of this video, I will include a little picture, and you will be able to see exactly how they were girding up their loins. It gives like a step-by-step instruction. This is just for your information, just something that I thought was interesting that I'm passing along to you. Okay, so that's the girdle. Now, moving along, we have an outer garment. This was also called a mantle, which is a term I know you're familiar with. The outer garment was like an overcoat, or what here, we in the West, we have winter coats, and this is what's going to protect you from wind. It's going to protect you from the elements, whether there's rain or cold. It was made of wool, goat's hair, and sometimes cotton. And again, it served as a shelter from wind, and it doubled. It had a dual purpose. It doubled as a blanket at night. So recall, if you will, some of these, for instances here. Elijah smote Jordan with his outer garment, his mantle, when he crossed over with Elisha. And it was this same mantle that he passed down to Elisha when he was caught away. So this was the outer garment. So he was passing down to Elisha a way for him to be protected from the elements, and also a way for him to have covering in the evening. It's basically a blanket you walk around in, because if you'll recall, when the tent dwellers especially would go to sleep at night, they basically just lay down on a mat. Well, if you were staying with someone in their home, it wasn't common for them to offer you a blanket. They expected you to use your outer garment. You just laid down wherever you were with your outer garment on. Haha, I didn't even realize I had a jacket on right now. They laid down with their outer garment, and this served as a blanket for them, or as a covering. Now, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, remember this story? Those 3 Hebrew boys that were thrown in the fire? They were actually thrown into the fire with all of the garments on. So they were clad head to toe. They weren't just thrown in with an inner garment. They actually even had their outer garments on. And regarding the outer garment, this is interesting and something that I may have heard, but I didn't really take too much notice of until studying this lesson. Now, Moses, you know, who passed down all the laws and gave all of these different rules and regulations, he had a very strict law regarding the outer garment. Now, if someone gave you their outer garment to borrow, hey, you're, I don't know, going on a journey, or you need to run to town or whatever, you can borrow my outer garment. It was customary and required by this law that you had to return that garment by sundown, because the person who loaned it to you is going to require that outer garment for a covering at night. So, like I said, it was so easy for them to go to bed. All they did was use their outer garment as a covering. They'd lay down on the mat. And these particular outer garments were so closely woven together that they could even be waterproof. So if you had to sleep outside, if you were for whatever reason you were sleeping on the roof. Maybe it's summertime, you know, and you wanted to sleep outside to enjoy the night air, and it starts raining. Well, if you had your outer garment on, you would be protected from that rain. That's how tightly that they were woven together. All right, so if you look on page 40, kind of right there, like the second paragraph. So regarding the law that we just discussed that Moses had given out, he says, do not keep back your undergarment from one who, I'm sorry, Jesus speaking here, not Moses. Do not keep back your undergarment from the one who robs you of your outer one. In other words, if someone steals your coat, which if you're a robber, the easiest garment for you to rob off of me is my outer garment, my coat, right? So don't just hold back your outer garment. If they're willing to steal this, you be willing to go the second mile and give your inner garment to them. And this seems like kind of a, a confusing statement here, but this is understood by these people easily because the outer garment would be the most easiest to steal. But if anyone wishes to go to law with you, deprive him not of the undergarment, but let him take your outer one also. Why? Because a Jewish court would not award an outer garment as a judgment because of the rule the law of Moses had already referred to. So they would have awarded the undergarment. Here, you can take the undergarment. I got another one at home, but you can't have my outer garment because my outer garment is what is going to serve as a covering. This is where Jesus is advocating for us to go a second mile, as Christians do. Excuse me. So because of the fullness of the mantle, this was kind of a billowy, a lot of fabric to it, that you were able to carry stuff in it. You could carry all kinds of things in that thing. So the lap, and I'm assuming it's like maybe the inside or some part of this you could use to carry grain or fruit. Jesus says, give, and it shall be given unto you, good measure, pressed down, you guys know this verse, and shaken together and running over, shall men give into your bosom. In other words, you can keep all the good stuff in that outer mantle, and when you give, those that you give to, someone else is willing to give to you so that you can have good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and it's going to be spilling out of your pockets because you were willing to give. If you'll recall, when Ruth was gleaning in Boaz's field, she could put 6 measures of barley into her mantle. So the upper garment or the outer garment had served many useful purposes. We discussed you could keep stuff in it. I'm sure it had, I don't know if they would have like a pocket, but I would assume some type of pocket construction. And then you could use it as a covering for sleeping. It could also protect you from the elements, wind, rain, etc. Keep you warm when it was cool. Lots of useful purposes there. So the next section, the headdress. Now, I'm not exactly sure of the time period that this particular workbook is discussing because you and I both know how important hair is in our beliefs and in even the Jewish customs. And this particular reference is talking about how the men wore their hair longer. Now, I know that more the Palestinian Arabs, they are more particular about their hair length, especially on the men. The men grow their hair long. And then you may or may have not seen it. If you haven't, it's kind of interesting to watch. You could check out YouTube or maybe Google it or whatever. And the way the men would wear their hair is they tie it up in this big turban and they wear it, you can't really tell that it's there, but they keep it pulled back. So, but the headdress that they're discussing here is a type of turban. And in the public, the Jews always wore a turban. It was always there. And it was to protect them from the sun. It was a long linen or cotton fabric, and it was wrapped several times around the head. Now, more modern Palestinians, and this is probably what you are more used to seeing in the news or anything that you would have seen within the last, oh goodness, probably, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 years, maybe even, is the kafia. And it is what they wear now. And I do have a picture of that also. And I will be sharing that at the end of this video. And you'll recognize it immediately and you'll know, oh yes, I've seen that before. I know what that is. All right, moving on. Sandals. Now, I know in the Philippines, you guys are very... you guys wear a lot of sandals. You wear a lot of comfortable shoes. Most of you are very familiar with a slipper. Well, this was a little bit more structured than a slipper is. But these shoes were a very simple, the primary type of shoe that was worn. And it was made typically of wood or a leather sole. They tied it on or kept it attached to their foot with leather cords or thongs, and it would wrap on there. And as I know that you're aware of, there are many, many references to sandals, including when an angel tells Peter, gird thyself up and bind on thy sandals. That's found in Acts 12:8. And then, of course, when John the Baptist references the latchet of the Messiah, that he is not worthy to loosen. That's found in Mark 1:7. So, not a whole lot of new information there as far as the sandal goes. Everybody wore them. There were a few people, probably those, again, that were more wealthy, that had a shoe that was a more, that covered the whole foot. But it's also possible that the toes were left exposed. Excuse me. All right. Now, now there was a difference between women's dress and men's dress. Now, it wasn't as obvious as dress is different between men and women now. For the most part, like I mentioned earlier, it kind of looked the same. They all wore the inner garment, which was a long tunic, either to the knees or to the ankles. But women especially probably had a longer tunic that at least went to the ankles. Now, we're very familiar with Deuteronomy 2:5, where men and women are forbidden to wear the clothing of each other. Women's clothes were different in detail rather than in kind. Again, so it was a similar type of garment. The difference came in the detail. A woman's tunic or clothes were more elaborate. Again, probably longer, and they had larger mantles. So when I read this, I couldn't help but thinking, it's because the women being the mamas. And if you're a mama, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Or if you're an auntie, or if you're a big sister, if you're an ate, whatever. How many times have you been asked to hold this? Every single time I go to church, I'm asked to hold this, and it's either a toy, it's somebody's Bible, it's perhaps a dirty Kleenex, a tissue, Oh my goodness. Over the years, there's been just a dozen million things that I've been asked, hey mom, hold this. And so in my mind, I'm thinking, yes, of course the women had larger mantles because they were constantly holding everything for everybody else. So these poor women, while they had more beautiful clothes, most likely because they were more elaborate, they were also having to carry around larger mantles because everybody was asking them to hold something. I don't know that that's necessarily true, but in my imagination, I'm thinking, well, yeah, because as a mom, I carry a big purse, but mostly it's because I'm carrying everybody else's stuff too. So one of the most distinctive differences was the veil that was worn by the women. Now, women rarely ever went without this veil. Occasionally, they might take it off in front of servants. And again, maybe even while they're traveling, they may put it back just to have the sun in their face. If you recall the story of Rebecca, she's traveling along, and when she sees Isaac approaching, she immediately uses the veil and pulls it back in front and covers her face. One important note is that prostitutes were unveiled. So if you saw a woman who was unveiled, and by unveiled I mean her face was not covered, it probably meant either that she was a very young girl, or she could have been a loose woman, or maybe someone who was not necessarily Arab, but she was Hebrew. Now, the Hebrew women during this time, they had a little more freedom. If you'll recall, this is something I need to look up further, but in Genesis 12 and 14, the Egyptian saw Sarah's face. Well, the only way he could have seen her face is if she was unveiled. And in 1 Samuel 1 and 12, Eli, now this is a very familiar story to me because I was a Bible quizzer, and so I immediately recalled this instance. Eli marked Hannah's mouth while she was praying, while she was, earnestly seeking God's face for, the miracle of a son. Eli marked her mouth. He thought she was drunk. Well, the only way he could have marked her mouth is if Hannah had been unveiled. So the Hebrew women had a little more freedom when it came to the veil covering, but most the Palestinian women, especially in different religious sects, S-E-C-T-S, religious groups rather, they were much more particular about the covering of the face. And so they also had headgear. They had another piece that was worn, and it was a high cap. It was worn at the front, and they would sew or attach rows of gold or silver coins, and this was done for not only ornamentation, but it was also a way to showcase, I guess is the word, their dowry. Now, these coins were very precious, not because they were expensive, but because they represented this woman's character. This made her stand out. This made her more individual next to any of the other women. And only for extreme, dire circumstances or emergencies would any of these women ever spend these coins. This is what they saved for, like I said, their dowry or for other future use. Now, if you'll recall the woman that lost a coin, this was the coin she lost, the one that went in her headdress here. And so it gave shame to her because she had lost that. This wasn't grocery money she had lost. This was something that showed, who she was and the type of character that she had. So she lost something that was considered an ornament unto her, but also her dowry. It was critical that she found that coin. And the second piece to the woman's headgear was a veil, which we had discussed. It was very large, probably at least 6 feet long by 4 feet wide, and it covered the head cap or the high cap, except it left the coins exposed. Now, if you look in your notes there on page 41. You can see the little picture drawing, and the lady on the right hand has the high cap, and then you can also see the row of coins there on the other lady. So generally the veil was made out of linen. It could be embroidered or covered in needlework. It was very elaborate, very ornate. All right. I'm doing pretty good on time. All right, the ornamentation. So, in other words, like, what kind of jewelry, what kind of, bling are these people wearing? Now, the men, they weren't wearing a whole lot. Very little ornamentation. They may or may not be carrying a type of cane or a stick, and it could be embellished on the top. But the primary function of this cane really was to fend off wild dogs. So it was really more about protection rather than ornamentation. It had no significance as far as establishing them as royal or establishing them as being wealthy. It was really just for protection. The men also wore a signet ring, and it was sometimes either worn on the hand, or they would put it on a chain or cord around their neck. This was the personal signature of that owner, or his seal. And again, it was not not usually worn as an ornament. Now the women, and again, this is probably referencing more the Arab women. They had more elaborate ornamentation in various forms of jewelry, such as earrings, bracelets, anklets, nose rings, etc. Now, the next to the last section there on page 42 is the special dress of the Pharisees. Now, it wasn't so much that it was unique to the Pharisees, because everyone wore these two articles, but it was the way that the Pharisees utilized these articles to an extreme. The first one was the phylactery, which is a metal box, or sometimes a linen, like parchment paper or whatever, that was carried around. And it was tied to the wrist, or even placed on the head. And it was passages of scripture referring to the Passover and redemption of the firstborn from Egypt. So this is something that all the Jewish men would wear. It was just part of their daily dress, their custom. And the second thing was the blue fringe that was placed on the corners of the mantle. So the four corners of a mantle. Now, the Pharisees took this to an extreme in the sense that they had broad phylacteries. They were very big, very obnoxious, very noticeable, and they had very long fringes. And their proud use of these things were what caused Jesus to condemn them. You can't just serve me and just be humble about it. You need everybody looking at you and like making, a show of yourself. That was, where he had issues with them, was their proud spirit. And so the last section here is the dress of Christ. Now, it would be silly of us to assume that just because Jesus was the Christ, the Messiah, that he would dress any differently than those around him. So his clothing was very similar to anybody else that you would come across during those times. He probably had a white turban, just like all the men wore. He would have kept his hair probably long and with an uncut beard. Now, that may or may not be debatable to some, but I figure most most of the custom at that time was a long beard. He did have a tunic that was one piece and without seam, which we've heard talked about earlier, that the Roman soldiers cast lot for. So it was probably a very valuable piece of clothing. Over the tunic, he wore a talith, which is a loose and flowing, which would have been that outer garment, but not the mantle. chances are it was blue, a very common color to wear, or maybe white with brown stripes, which is another common variation that they wore during that time. He had the fringe on the four corners, just like we discussed earlier, and no doubt sandals. And he will also, anytime that they were going traveling or for walking for long distances, no doubt, he was always had his loins girded about and probably traveled along with some kind of walking stick or a cane, like we mentioned with some of the other men. So that's one of the awesome things about Jesus, is he never goes above and beyond or does anything that you and I aren't able to do. He's always able to relate to us, not only in our emotional, in our spiritual, and our physical needs and different things that we go through and experience, but even in our day-to-day dress. You know, he was just one of the people. And that's how he is. You know, he's just one of us. Although we know him as Savior, we know him as healer, we know him as Redeemer, but when it came to day-to-day life, he looked just like you and me. He was able to be touched and experienced all of those things that you and I would experience, and all of those things that those he traveled with and those that he cared for during that time were exposed to. So that is it for tonight. Again, I will have those pictures for you guys after this video. Thank you again so much for your time tonight. You guys have a fantastic week. I'll be praying for you. You guys take care. God bless.